series on my channel that I hope to add to once or twice a month. It won't be overly long because I don't have that many authors who fit into my criteria. My goal is to present a collection of fiction authors you can trust to read. So I'm going to cover fiction books with this series, but I'll be covering the authors who write them as opposed to the individual books. And what I want to do is present authors that you can trust to do two things in their writings. First, to present stories that are free of grotesque descriptions of violence and sex and language. Now, I'm not saying books that are free of violence or sex, but grotesque or overly graphic descriptions of them. I try to go by the Bible itself when I judge what I will allow in books that I read. The Bible contains violence. It contains sex, wickedness, and righteousness. There is idolatry and the worship of God. All of it is in the scriptures. But the Bible is neverly needlessly graphic in its depictions. And so we can have stories like those in Judges or Revelation that predict times that are truly horrific events and prophecies, but it's done in a way that never encourages the reader into mental or internal sin. So I am looking for books that have dramatic events, heroes and villains, worlds that are hanging in the balance, heroes that might fall into the darkness, villains that could change and turn from their evil actions. I want excitement in my reading, and I want authors that I can recommend for you to trust to make really good writings. Quality stories. You can be fairly confident that when you pick up books that have these authors' names on the cover, that their books will be enjoyable and entertaining, and you might even gain something worthwhile along the way. I've been asked on several occasions of authors that I would recommend for a teenage son or a Christian dad who likes to read fiction. But it's difficult at times to find those authors who are both good at writing and also don't fill their stories with needless immorality. So these are the authors that I'm looking for, and so I want to present you with the ones that I have found myself. In part, this series is based on my love for Michael Crichton when I was in school. I read Jurassic Park for the first time in third grade, something that I would never recommend for a third grader. I don't think Michael Crichton is the type of writer based upon morality that you want a third grader or a sixth grader or even a 10th grade Christian young man to be reading. But my parents didn't know any better about what was in his books and what he was writing about. They were just happy that I was reading. So my goal is to present authors to you where you can be glad your kids are reading their books, and also books that dad can know. If I pick up a book by this guy and I'm reading it and my kid looks over my shoulder at what I'm reading, I'm not going to be ashamed of what they're going to find in the books that I'm spending my time in. Now, I'm not claiming that every book that is written by these suggested authors will be quality, because I haven't read all of their books. I don't got that much time, and people do put out clunkers every now and again. For that reason, I'm going to put the covers of all the books that I have read by the authors I am suggesting, and I'll also list them in the descriptions so you know what books I'm building my recommendation based upon. So I'm going to start off here with a bang, and that is by presenting you with my favorite fiction author. The one, the only, Brandon Sanderson. Brandon writes fantasy novels, and he also tips his toe in a few other genres. I personally see Brandon as the 21st century J.R.R. Tolkien. From my view, if they were to make a faithful movie adaptation of his books, they would be as big a hit as The Lord of the Rings. And I've read his books in the Stormlight Archives, the Mistborn series, the Reckoner series, and some of his standalone books as well. What makes Brandon so good is that he is a master at building worlds that are like ours, but distinctively his own, and each is different from the one that came before. His systems of magic or superpowers, depending on your perspective, are always inventive. Some of them are challenging to wrap your mind around and rewarding once you really understand how magic or powers are presented in his world. His characters are complex. They're deep. His heroes are flawed. His villains are not always predictable. And at times, it's a wonderful guessing game to try to determine who's going to be the villain in this particular series. My favorite Brandon Sanderson books are his Mistborn series. And I would encourage adults that if you're going to be reading Brandon Sanderson for the first time, I would suggest starting with that trilogy of books. So if you're reading your very first Brandon Sanderson book, you should pick up The Final Empire, which is the first of those three books. It's a great series. It ends really well, which sometimes fantasy series don't, and it's a nice compact 3-volume set that I think you can get through easily if you enjoy fantasy series, and it's a great place to start. Now, if you're a young adult, if you have a teenage son, a college student who's interested in fantasy writing, I would suggest that they start with The Reckoners. The Reckoners is a superhero series that's put in a world where everyone who has superpowers is a villain. So the only heroes are those who have no powers. And book 1 of the Reckoner series is the book Steelheart. But I gotta end by saying that the crown jewel of Brandon's career will end up being the Stormlight Archive, which begins with the book The Way of Kings. I have no idea how long this series will be. I've been with it since the beginning, and I'm just gonna carry it away the whole time until it's finished. Every time he comes out with another book in the midst of his Stormlight Archives books, I'm always like, Brandon, get down to detail. Get down to what's important. We need more Stormlight books. They're wonderful. The characters are great. I cannot wait to see how he's going to wrap up this series, and who knows how many books it's going to take him to do that. It might be a frustration to see how many books he's planning to put into that series, but I'm really enjoying it. So my first fiction author to trust is Brandon Sanderson. And if you've never read any of his books, just reading Brandon Sanderson will probably keep you filled with reading for the next year or two. And if you enjoyed this recommendation, I'd encourage you to subscribe to the Rev Reads YouTube channel.